The 72nd session of the United Nations General Assembly is underway in New York.
Okay, you guys are up. And just start when you're ready, Paul.
Hello, welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show that comes to you live every Tuesday here on Facebook Live. And joining me today on Facebook Live is Shaka Ssali himself. And Shaka, welcome to Shaka Extra Time.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How have you been?
I have been hugely terrific.
Let's take this opportunity to welcome all our Facebook followers and YouTube who are watching us live from all over the world. And remember that today Shaka is taking your questions. But before we go to your comments, let's start with what's happening here in the United States. World leaders are gathered in New York for the 52nd General Assembly.
72nd,
I beg your pardon. Yeah, 72nd General Assembly. And they're being hosted in New York under the auspices of the UN General Assembly. Let's talk about that. Your thoughts on what's going on so far.
Well, this is, of course, something that happens every year. But I think perhaps what is very important in this particular 72nd session of the United Nations General Assembly is because, one, the US President, Donald Trump, this is his first time to address the session, to address the world body. The other, of course, for Africa is the fact that Nigerian president finally made it to New York and actually addressed the world body. Because let's face it, only last month he was, pretty much under treatment, medical treatment, in the United Kingdom.
In fact, I watched him. He looked a little bit frail. He was struggling through his speech, but I think he did a remarkable job. He talked about a few things that I think we could highlight. For example, he talked about democracy in Africa. He talked about the ongoing mass killings in Myanmar. He talked about North Korea. Maybe let me get your thoughts on some of what President Buhari said.
I think in particular he addressed the issue, for example, of the funding of peacekeepers. He talked also about the fact that this funding, first and foremost, needs to be predictable and sustainable. He also said that he definitely needs the help to fight Islamic militants, and especially given that we're talking about Boko Haram in northeastern part of Nigeria.
How about President Trump, this being his first address to the UN General Assembly? Your impressions, did he meet that benchmark that a lot of people were talking about?
No surprises. He basically reiterated the fact that the American people actually voted for him so that he can return power back to them, and that he is doing it. And he talked about the concept of America first, and that he also thinks that, come on, man, if you are a president of a particular country, your country should come first. And this is about providing, for example, security to your people, defending your values, and making sure that you interact with the other countries of the world.
There are some critics out there who think that he was a little extreme when he went after North Korea about the deal signed by Iran, United States and Iran, the peace deal. Your thoughts?
Well, don't forget that the UN Security Council passed a resolution recently appealing to North Korea to make sure that it basically stops really threatening world security, especially when it comes to this business of nuclear weapons and all that kind of stuff. And he seems to be saying, for example, in one of his tweets, that North Korea has not fought a war for probably more than 50 years, and yet, when you look at the chests of its generals, they have so many medals, that kind of stuff. He also says that, the country, North Korea, has essentially to figure out a way of meeting really the resolution. If it doesn't, he will probably look for something else. Of course, there are a lot of other world leaders, including the Secretary General himself, says that what is needed really in this particular case is a political solution.
What seems to be the main focus of this UN General Assembly?
The General Assembly is looking at, essentially really looking at the life of people, improving the quality of life, that kind of stuff really. It's about, making sure that people, they have an environment in which they can realize their potential, in which they can feed themselves, in which they can feel that they are indeed citizens of the world.
Let's talk about United States is usually the host of the UNG, the UN General Assembly, but it surprises me sometimes. I don't understand the politics behind who gets to speak first. In most cases, you would think that since the United States is the host country, it should therefore be the first to make like a statement. But in most cases, it's Brazil, and then United States, and followed by other countries. What is the politics behind that?
In fact, it is not in most cases. It is in all cases. First of all, let's face it, the United States is not only a host country of the United Nations General Assembly. The United States happened to have taken a lead following the end of the Second World War, which led to the formation of what we know today as the United Nations. Obviously, before that, you had the League of Nations, by the way, which was headquartered in San Francisco, in California. But this particular United Nations was able to be headquartered in Manhattan, in New York, as a result of the Bretton Woods, institutions, kind of like conference, really. The reason why Brazil happens to be the first to address the UN General Assembly, or the president of Brazil, is because when the UN came into being, Brazil happened to have had the opportunity of having its person, its official, as the first president of the UN General Assembly. That is basically the trick.
So maybe that's perhaps one of the reasons why everybody is calling for UN reforms. If this is something that hasn't changed for years, I'm sure there are other countries. At least maybe they should try going alphabetically. Let's say you start with countries that start with an A and end with countries like Zimbabwe that end with a Z.
One could say
Wouldn't that make sense?
One could say that, but when the UN, first of all, the UN United Nations was formed, there are a lot of other countries, frankly, which were not on board. It was formed by a few countries, but that probably is not really neither here nor there. When we talk about reforms, we are really talking about the 5 permanent, members of the UN Security Council. Because let's face it, the UN Security Council actually controls the United Nations, because it deals with the peace and global peace and stability, as you know. And it is only 5 countries, that is, of course, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, which actually wields what they call veto power. And each of those vetoes, actually, to be very honest with you, cannot be overridden. In other words, only one permanent member of the UN Security Council could actually hold the world hostage.
Let's talk a little bit about reforms. You alluded to the fact that the United Nations is part of the Bretton Woods institutions, for example, the IMF, the World Bank. These are institutions that have been in place for over 50 years. The rules and regulations that govern these bodies were made then. Today we live in a totally different world. It's a globalized world. There's so much that is happening all over the world. But for some reason, these institutions haven't changed. What would it take to change these institutions? For example, when it comes to voting or holding veto power, Africa doesn't have a say. We have over 1 billion people on this planet. India doesn't have even a veto power. So how can some of these countries that have, or emerging countries that have come up and they have some kind of, they need some kind of representation at the Security Council, how can they do it?
You could also, of course, add South America, or sometimes referred to as Latin America. There are a lot of people, of course, who think like you, Paul, who think that it is high time that there are really fundamental reforms that would obviously make sure that Africa, Latin America also come on the table. Because it really does not make sense, for example, to have two European countries. You could even, in fact, say three, because to a certain degree, even Russia, partially, in fact, could be said to be a European country. You have France, you have the United Kingdom. And when you think about the population of those three countries, actually, they are even much less than the entire population of Latin America, the entire population of Africa for that matter. So it is true that reasonable people definitely feel that it is a high time that you should have fundamental UN reforms which would make it a little bit more democratic. Because as it were right now, neither the United Nations nor the other actually sister members of the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank Group or the International Monetary Fund, could actually be seen to be democratic. They are not. They are far from being democratic. And yet, they require some of these new countries, guess what, to be democratic.
Interesting. Let's go to the comments. Let's start with a Facebook comment from Mayadi Latit. African presidents are at it again, going to spend hundreds and thousands of dollars in the US while the people are living in poverty. Your thoughts?
You know, it is very interesting, of course, what the brother is saying. There are a lot of people who question this business of the yearly ritual whereby African leaders, or world leaders indeed, meet in New York, spend a couple of days, sometimes a week. And as a matter of fact, some of the African leaders, let's face it, they come with Gulfstream jet planes. They also spend sometimes in suites where they pay, like taxpayers pay 15,000 to 20,000 US dollars a night. Whereas, compare, for example, when Barack Obama was president, he would live actually in a hotel where the US pays less than $10,000 a room. And this is a man who obviously was heading a country that is one of the richest in the world and provides a lot of aid throughout the world. The Prime Minister of Britain, for example, flies British Airways, first class, from London to JFK, and actually stays in a hotel where they would pay less than $8,000 a night. But can you imagine, for example, a president from one of the poorest countries in East Africa would actually pay 15,000 to 20,000 US dollars a night? And when a New York Times reporter asks him how to justify that, and he says, look, I don't really like this business of people having the audacity to ask me how much I pay where I live. I used to live in tents. I used to live in trenches. Can you imagine?
Well, that looks to be like the problem with a lot of African leaders. In fact, there is another comment here from another Facebook follower who says that he doesn't get it. What's the point of all these African presidents going to New York and taking these huge delegations?
As a matter of fact, I was told that the Zimbabwean president, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, is again in New York with at least a 70 person delegation. Can you imagine?
70.
70.
And they're all paid for by the state?
By the state, by the taxpayer.
Okay, let's go to Patrick Fayondi from Tanzania. Since you happen to visit my country several times, mention any differences you observed in terms of democracy.
Well, first of all, Patrick, I think that is a very important question. But I have to be very honest with you that having been in Tanzania for a week, I would not want to come across as if, in fact, I was an expert that would have some kind of accurate report card as to what is democracy or what is not. I don't also like to be seen as a parachute journalist. I used to be a paratrooper when I was in the military, and that was fine. But this time around, I can only say that I can probably respond in a manner that allows me to tell you what I heard from the people that I interacted with on the ground while I was in Tanzania for a week.
Let's go to another commenter from Guy Jack. I wonder, every time the UN Security Council met on South Sudan, the problems seem to be the last issue they ever addressed. What's your take?
Before I go there, I think I should be allowed really to respond to Patrick's question, because I did not finish to respond to his question. I was trying to say that I could only feel confident in responding to Patrick based on the people that I interacted with while I was on the ground in Tanzania. And based on that, I can frankly say that it seems that the democratic space has been increasingly shrinking in Tanzania, based on the mainland and on the island of Zanzibar. It seemed to be a little bit better before the coming into power of incumbent President John Pombe Magufuli. As a matter of fact, earlier today, I also read that there is an independent newspaper, a Swahili newspaper, which has actually been closed for carrying an article that seems to be, in a way, perhaps not disrespecting the person of the head of state. So you can imagine when you talk about the freedom of expression, the freedom of the press, and what have you. So it doesn't look good from at least the people I talked with.
And maybe going back to the people you talked to, I remember us having a conversation with the former Prime Minister, who also, by the way, ran for president in the last election, and he could not talk about the current political situation in his own country.
That is correct. You are obviously talking about former Tanzanian Prime Minister Edward Lowassa, a man who ran as a presidential candidate for the opposition Chadema. Yeah, I remember that we actually wanted to talk to him about the state of democracy in his country. He frankly said that he did not think, frankly, he could do that under the prevailing circumstances. And he went on essentially to react to what the Kenyan Supreme Court had actually done on September 1st when it annulled the election of President Uhuru Kenyatta.
Very ironic. He
Very
could
ironic.
comment on Kenya, but he can't comment on his own country.
That is very true, but that is not very unusual in Africa. People will tell you that.
Let's
in fact,
go
there
to...
was a time when Western media used to be headquartered in Nairobi in East Africa. The New York Times, CNN, Los Angeles Times, and what have you. And in fact, they could write about every other country from Nairobi, but they could not write about Kenya critically because they were based in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi.
Interesting. Let's cross over to Zambia. We have a question from Mwangana Ngenda from Zambia, and he says, the international observers who come to Africa to observe elections should instead monitor the electoral process in its entirety, or else they should stop coming. What do you think, Shaka?
I think he has a point. I couldn't agree with him more, but I don't honestly think that the international observers will have the resources or the time to go that way. I think first and foremost what is needed sincerely is that these countries like Zambia, they need first and foremost to have a truly independent electoral commission. A commission that does not depend, for example, on the privileges granted to it by the chief executive of a country who happens to be a president. If the Electoral Commission is independent, and you also have, for example, an independent judiciary, then you don't have to worry about, in fact, what kind of role the international observers will play. Let's face it, we don't pretty much have international observers here in the United States when they really have an election that weigh in one way or the other. It is the same thing. You went to Makerere. Before you get a degree, you have external examiners, correct?
Correct.
I went to UCLA. We never had external examiners, but we had degrees.
Let's cross over to Sierra Leone. Let's go to Alaje Barema Koka. He says, is real democracy in those three countries that you visited at stake?
First of all,
what lessons did you learn from those countries?
First of all, I don't know exactly what he means by real democracy, because let's face it, what is real democracy? Democracy, as somebody once said, is a work in progress, no matter where you are, including here in the United States of America. But if you talk about whether I felt that one country probably was slightly better than the others in terms of the democratic space, I can only say that not very much really. Of course, I was told by government officials, and indeed sometimes supported by some of the independent people that I interacted with in the DRC capital Kinshasa, that you can't frankly ask for too much of democracy in a country that has actually been under war footing. You have wars in the eastern DRC almost all the time, and this time around, of course, we did have some kind of conflicts really raging in Kasai, those types of situations. But even then, I'm encouraged by the fact that there is some kind of ongoing voter registration. And so far, if I have to believe what I have seen, they have actually, the government has, I think, registered more than 40 million people who are expected to participate in the next election. When it is held, I don't know. When we talk about Zambia, I think that it is very disappointing, frankly, because at least in the past, Zambia used to be one of those countries, when you talked about Africa, which happened to be one of the beacons of hope for African democracy. But as you saw, we were together in Lusaka and what have you, talking to people. It seemed to be pretty much the same thing, really, as we found in Tanzania. People were not very free to express themselves. People did feel that, there is something that they feared, which means, obviously, unless you have freedom of expression, and if you have freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, freedom of the media, I don't see how you can begin talking about democracy. And then, of course, we already talked about Tanzania. There's a lot of problem. Again, frankly, both Tanzania and Zambia, I think that need a lot, really, a lot of improvement in terms of the democratization process and in terms of how people, the ordinary people, feel. At the moment, they don't really feel like they have citizenship rights. They feel like subjects.
Okay, we'll pray for them. I hope they feel better, not bitter, right? Let's move along. Some of your fans want to know your take on lifting the age limit in Uganda. It's a debate that is ongoing.
Yeah.
It's caused a lot of protests. The entire country has been militarized as we speak. So your take on lifting term limits in Uganda?
I can say that, frankly, in principle, I do not have problems with lifting age limit. I'm sure you're talking about age limit,
yes,
not term limit.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
In principle, I do not have problems of removing the age cap, but if it is being lifted simply because it has to benefit the incumbent president, Yoweri Museveni, for his personal or political reasons, then I do not support it at all.
We have another time for one more comment. We have Anambra. She says, what can be done to have gender equity on the continent?
Well, first of all, it is a process. It is neither an incident nor an event. I think it will take a lot of civic education, it will take a lot of socialization, it will take a lot of what I would say fundamental changes in both men and women's attitudes and mindsets about the need for equal status for the different genders, because at the end of the day, frankly, it is just a human right. It's a human right.
Let's go to Eriot in Uganda. He asks, what's your assessment on democracy in Tanzania after we left, an opposition MP was shot? So he wants to get your reaction to that.
I can only say that, frankly, I am not surprised that some of those things can happen, because, again, as we said, even some of the most important players in the country were not feeling free to express themselves. For a man like the president of the Tanganyika Law Society, Mr. Lisu, a man who was very, very critical, by the way, of the policies of incumbent President John Pombe Magufuli, to be able to be treated like that, it is very unfortunate. Of course, there are people who say that these were probably thugs, not necessarily state agents, but Chadema has come out openly to say that it is the state, in their view, which must be behind basically what was to be really an assassination of a major critic of the incumbent government. It's very unfortunate.
What are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow, of course, we are looking at the significance of the 72nd session of the United General Assembly in New York.
Any final thoughts, Shaka?
Well, again, it's about democracy, because let's face it, we talk about all sorts of things. I can assure you from my experience, there's no way any country is going to develop, is going to give opportunities to its daughters and sons to be the best they can be without democracy.
A lot of people are interested in knowing the difference between politicians who, for example, claim they're politicians, but when at the core, they're dictators. How would you explain that?
What do you mean? What's the difference between a politician and a dictator?
There are those guys who claim that they're serving the interests of the people, but at the core, they're really there for themselves.
I'm sure you know that people actually say that when politicians are running for office, they do so in poetry. They actually promise heaven on earth. But when they are elected and it gets to the business of governing, that one they do in prose. They actually deal and react and respond to the obtaining political reality. So it depends on the pressure that comes from people who think and feel legitimately that they are citizens, that they own constitution, they have a right to own an opinion, and in which case they have constitutional rights, inalienable rights. To a certain degree, you could say, in fact, birthright. But if you behave like a subject who obviously owes your allegiance to an individual authority who may be a dictator or a king, then unfortunately you have to wait for that person's privileges.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Shaka, for joining us on Shaka Extra Time. And to you all our viewers watching us from all over the world, we thank you, and come back again next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen, we're out.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you. I think we went out a little bit early.
Is it?